The moment everything changed, Professor Lewis turned back to the class, her piercing gaze sweeping across the room. "We often believe the image is the media presents to us," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. "But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, is it the truth?" The room fell into a focused silence. "Let's consider an example," she continued, writing a name on the board, one that instantly made Barron's chest tighten. "Melania Trump." A shift rippled through the lecture hall. Some students exchanged amused glances. A few chuckled under their breath. Barron clenched his hands lightly. He knew this wasn't going to be just another lecture. Jessica leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "This should be interesting." In the back, Mark casually adjusted his phone, unintentionally hitting the record button, completely unaware that he was about to capture a moment that would change Barron Trump's life forever. And Barron? He sat still, barely breathing. He had promised himself he would stay unnoticed, that his identity would remain hidden. But as the professor's next words echoed through the hall, he knew he wouldn't stay silent for much longer. "Barron Trump speaks." Professor Lewis crossed her arms, standing tall in the center of the lecture hall. "Let's talk about Melania Trump," she began, her tone laced with subtle mockery. "A woman praised by the media for her elegance, her flawless appearance. But tell me, has she actually contributed anything meaningful to society?" The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. A few students let out soft chuckles. Others exchanged glances, waiting to see where this was going. Barron tightened his fists under the desk. His heartbeat pounded in his chest. But he stayed silent. He knew better than to react too quickly. In the front row, Jessica raised an intrigued eyebrow. "This is going to be a good one," she murmured. Professor Lewis walked over to the board and wrote 2 words in large letters: "Image versus impact." Then, turning back to the class, she posed a pointed question. "We live in a world where image often outweighs substance. Melania Trump, celebrated for her grace and composure, but is she truly a role model worth honoring?" The classroom buzzed with murmurs. "Let's look at the reality," Professor Lewis continued, her voice razor-sharp. "We had a First Lady whose speeches were often overshadowed by comments about her accent rather than the substance of her words. A woman who launched the Be Best initiative to combat online bullying, yet married to a man infamous for his controversial remarks on social media." Laughter erupted from a corner of the room. In the back, Mark, always on the lookout for viral moments, subtly raised his phone and began recording. Something told him this discussion was about to take an interesting turn. Jessica nodded in agreement, resting her chin on her hand, eyes gleaming. "She's got a point. We tend to admire those with a polished image, forgetting how much of it is just media manipulation." A student in the back raised their hand. "Professor, are you saying we should judge people based on their actual contributions rather than just their public image?" "Exactly." Professor Lewis nodded, her eyes lighting up as more students engaged. But amid the divided reactions, one person remained completely still, like the calm before a storm. Barron lifted his head, his eyes sharp, unwavering. Every word from Professor Lewis felt like a dagger. They were mocking his mother. And this time, he would not stay silent. "Duo I de lafian ban kai tian kua kauchuan voi van fong man mi hun. Tauchio sauchon yan vat vartian teen kiek teen dash." The day a silent student changed everything. When Barron Trump spoke up, it was supposed to be just another lecture, the kind students half listened to while scrolling through their phones, waiting for the clock to run out. But on this day, something different was about to unfold in Lecture Hall 204 at Westwood University, something no one would forget. Professor Martha Lewis, known for her razor-sharp critiques and unfiltered opinions, paced in front of the class. She thrived on provocation, on pushing her students to challenge their own beliefs, though, more often than not, she enjoyed pushing them toward hers. She turned to the board and, in bold letters, wrote, "Perception versus reality." The room quieted. Students straightened in their seats, Something about the way she wrote those words signaled that today's discussion would be different. Professor Lewis turned to face the class. Her smirk unmistakable. Society often celebrates an image rather than true substance. She began. We admire elegance, grace, poise. But tell me, does elegance change the world? Does looking good in photographs leave a meaningful impact? A few students chuckled. Others nodded. Intrigued. Then, she turned back to the board and added a name beneath her first words, Melania Trump. This time, the reaction was more pronounced. Laughter rippled through the room. A few students exchanged knowing glances. In the third row, a quiet student sat still, his expression unreadable. His fists clenched just out of view beneath the desk. Why? Professor Lewis continued. Do we praise someone like Melania Trump when history has given us women who actually changed society? Eleanor Roosevelt, Michelle Obama. Women of true substance. Women who stood for something. More laughter. A few murmured agreements. Jessica, one of the brightest students in the class, smirked. This should be interesting. She whispered to Mark, the student beside her. Mark leaned in, amused. If there are any Melania fans in here, they're probably fuming right now. And then, something happened. A hand, one that had never been raised before, lifted into the air. The room froze. Professor Lewis, mid-sentence, snapped her head toward the source. A few students turned in their seats, curiosity flickering in their expressions. Jessica arched an eyebrow. Weird, she thought. I've never heard him say a word before. Mark, sensing something big, subtly adjusted his phone and hit record. In the third row, the silent student rose to his feet. His expression was calm, his gaze unwavering. And then, in a voice steady but powerful, Barron Trump spoke. Professor, he said, his words cutting through the silence, you make an interesting point. But let me ask you something, have you ever actually tried to understand who Melania Trump is? Or are you only seeing her through the image the media has created for you? The entire lecture hall held its breath. Professor Lewis hesitated for just a moment. No one had ever spoken to her like that. The breaking point. Jessica straightened in her chair. Mark tightened his grip on his phone. Eyes locked on the screen. Professor Lewis folded her arms, studying Barron with curiosity. So, she said, her voice sharp, you have something to add? Barron drew a deep breath. When he spoke, his tone was even, but laced with something undeniable, conviction. You speak about my mother as if she is nothing more than an image, a hollow figure, a carefully crafted persona. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, do you even know what she has been through? A stunned hush fell over the room. Mark's eyes widened. Wait, he whispered. Did he just say? Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She snapped her head toward Barron, her mind racing. Professor Lewis narrowed her eyes. Is that so? She mused, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. Then tell me, what exactly do you want to say about Melania Trump? Barron held her gaze. My mother was not born into wealth. She grew up in a small town in Slovenia, a place where no one could have imagined that one day she would walk through the doors of the White House. A few students sat up straighter. Curiosity piqued. She learned English on her own. She worked relentlessly. She built an international career from nothing, without connections, without privilege. She didn't seek the spotlight. She never asked for validation. But does that mean she did nothing? Jessica felt something shift inside her. She had never heard anyone talk about Melania Trump like this before. Professor Lewis opened her mouth to respond, but Barron wasn't finished. You say my mother is just a beautiful image. But do you even know what she endured as First Lady? His voice remained steady, not angry, but powerful. She was mocked, ridiculed, every expression scrutinized, every outfit dissected, every gesture picked apart. She was labeled a woman who stood in her husband's shadow, but has anyone ever actually sat down and listened to her? Has anyone ever looked beyond the carefully chosen photos the media decided to publish and asked, what has she done? What does she stand for? Silence. For the first time, Professor Lewis shifted slightly. Her posture no longer as certain as before. She parted her lips to speak. But Barron pressed on. You say my mother launched the Be Best initiative. But that it had no real impact? Then ask the children who have been bullied. Ask the families who have struggled under the crushing weight of online harassment. My mother never went on television to boast about what she was doing. But does that mean she did nothing? Mark leaned toward Jessica, whispering. I've never seen her at a loss for words like this. Jessica, always quick to argue, found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. Barron's gaze swept the room. We live in a world where people rush to judge. We believe the stories the media tells us without ever stopping to ask, who are these people? Really? He turned back to the professor. Professor, you've said the media has the power to manipulate public perception. But have you ever considered that maybe you, too, have been manipulated into believing only what they wanted you to see? The reckoning. No one moved. Jessica's lips parted slightly in shock. Mark's phone remained locked on Barron. He knew he had just recorded something that would go down in history. Professor Lewis remained silent for a few seconds, but in that moment, it felt like an eternity. Then, something unexpected happened. She nodded. Just once. Fair enough. Her voice had lost its usual cutting edge. Instead, it was measured, thoughtful. You've asked a question worth thinking about. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Mark finally lowered his phone. Exhaling, Jessica leaned back, crossing her arms. Her expression unreadable. What had started as just another lecture had become something much bigger. And no one in that room could have predicted what would happen next. The viral storm. The moment class ended, Mark uploaded the video to TikTok. A student silences an entire lecture hall, and makes a professor rethink everything. Within hours, it racked up 500,000 views. Within 24 hours, it exploded. Major news outlets, viral Twitter accounts, political commentators, everyone was talking about it. An unknown student had just changed the conversation. And the world was listening. Here's a refined and more engaging version of your story, enhancing the drama, emotional depth, and impact while preserving the original meaning. The moment that shook a lecture hall, when Barron Trump defended his mother and changed everything. It started as just another lecture, a routine discussion in a crowded university hall. Students half listened. Some took notes. Others absent-mindedly scrolled through their phones. No one expected this day to be different. But by the time the class ended, an entire room of students sat in stunned silence. A renowned professor had been challenged in a way she never saw coming. And the identity of the student responsible? That revelation sent shockwaves across the nation. It was a moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. The spark that ignited the fire. Professor Martha Lewis had always been known for her bold, unapologetic critiques. A respected academic and frequent guest on political panels, she prided herself on making her students think, or rather, pushing them toward her own worldview. That day, she strode to the front of the room with confidence. Turning to the whiteboard, with deliberate strokes, she wrote, "Perception versus reality." Students perked up, sensing this would be an interesting debate. The professor turned back to the class, a knowing smirk on her lips. Society often celebrates an image rather than true substance. She began. We admire elegance, grace, and poise. But tell me, does beauty change the world? Does looking good in photographs leave a meaningful impact? A few students chuckled, nodding along. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she added a name beneath the words, Melania Trump. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. A few exchanged knowing glances. Why? The professor continued. Do we praise someone like Melania Trump when history has given us women of true influence? Eleanor Roosevelt, Michelle Obama. Women who stood for something. This time, the laughter was louder. Some students nodded in agreement. Others smirked. But one student did neither. In the third row, Barron Trump sat completely still. his expression unreadable. His fists clenched just out of view. Jessica, one of the sharpest students in the class, leaned toward her friend Mark and whispered, "This should be good." Mark smirked. "If there are any Melania fans in here, they're probably fuming right now." Then something happened that no one expected. A hand rose into the air. The room fell silent. Professor Lewis turned, surprised. It wasn't just any student. It was Barron Trump. The moment that changed everything. Barron stood up. His expression calm but unshakable. His voice, though steady, carried an unmistakable weight. "Professor," he said, his tone measured, "you speak as if my mother is nothing more than an image. A hollow figure. A carefully crafted persona. But tell me, have you ever actually listened to her? Have you ever tried to understand who she truly is? Or are you only seeing her through the lens the media created for you?" A murmur spread through the room. Jessica's eyes widened. Mark, sensing something big, subtly hit record on his phone. Professor Lewis raised an eyebrow. Intrigued. "So," she said, "you have something to add?" Barron nodded. "My mother was not born into wealth. She grew up in a small town in Slovenia. A place where no one could have imagined she would one day walk through the doors of the White House. She learned English on her own. She worked relentlessly. She built an international career from nothing, without connections, without privilege. Silence. She never sought the spotlight. She never asked for validation. But does that mean she did nothing?" Jessica leaned in. She had never heard anyone defend Melania Trump like this before. Professor Lewis folded her arms. "So you're saying she made an impact?" Barron's gaze didn't waver. "You say my mother is just a beautiful image. But do you know what she endured as First Lady?" She was mocked, ridiculed, every expression scrutinized, every outfit dissected, every gesture picked apart. She was labeled a woman who stood in her husband's shadow. But has anyone ever actually listened to her? Has anyone ever looked beyond the photos the media chose to publish and asked, what does she stand for? A stunned hush filled the room. "You say her Be Best initiative had no real impact? Ask the children who have been bullied. Ask the families who have struggled with online harassment. My mother never went on television to boast about what she was doing. But does that mean she did nothing?" Professor Lewis hesitated. For the first time in her career, she had no immediate response. And in that moment, something shifted. The viral storm. The class ended. But the discussion had only just begun. Mark uploaded the video to TikTok with the caption, "A student silences an entire lecture hall, and makes a professor rethink everything." Within hours, it had 500,000 views. Within a day, it had exploded. Soon, the nation was talking. Supporters praised Barron's courage. For the first time, someone actually defended Melania Trump the way she deserves. He didn't just stand up for his mother, he exposed how easily biases shape our perception. Critics, however, pushed back. "This is just a publicity stunt. Melania Trump is still an empty figure. Nothing has changed." The professor was right. This student is just overly sensitive. But whether people loved or hated what had happened, one thing was undeniable. The conversation had started. The professor's response. Days later, Professor Lewis broke her silence. She posted a long message on Twitter. "As a professor, I have always prided myself on teaching students to ask critical questions. But last week, one of my students asked a question that made me rethink my own perspective. I haven't completely changed my views on public figures. But I have learned an important lesson: no one deserves to be judged solely on the image we see on the surface." Barron Trump, I hope you continue asking the hard questions. And I hope all of us learn to listen more before we judge. Barron read the professor's words and smiled. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need her to completely change her beliefs. He only needed one moment to make people think. And he had succeeded. A shift in the classroom. The following week, Lecture Hall 204 felt different. No mocking laughter. No dismissive smirks. Jessica leaned toward Barron, curiosity in her voice. What do you think Professor Lewis is going to say today? Barron simply smiled. He didn't need to answer. He had learned something that day. The truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be spoken at the right moment. Professor Lewis entered. Her usual smirk replaced by something softer. She set down her materials, glanced at her students, and spoke. Last week, a student made me think. I have always prided myself on teaching my students to ask the right questions. But I forgot something important. Sometimes I need to question myself too. She turned toward Barron. Thank you, Barron. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Jessica smirked. You did something no one thought was possible. Barron smiled. I don't need her to change her mind. I just need her to question it. And that was enough.